economic systems. And really the big idea here is that an economic system like communism or capitalism, these are huge umbrella terms describing the hundreds of businesses, the multitude of stores, and the millions of consumers, and how we consume services. And so we'll see terms, this is macroeconomics, like developing country. What does that mean? You know, we used to use the term third world, but now we use the term developing. It's a very technical term that we'll look at the context of. And then traditional economy versus maybe non-traditional, and what it means. And so the real question, I brought up Russia and China just a minute ago. Do you think they're better off? And once more, when we're talking about entire nations, I mean, Russia in terms of land mass is still the largest country in the world. So the question of are they better off? Well, that's a complex question. The same with China. Are they better off? Well, the short answer is their GDP, their gross domestic product, is higher than what it was when they were once a command economy. So now that they have more open economic systems, the GDP is higher. But then again, we've got to look at the complexities of how we measure that. So those countries who have experienced dramatic changes in their economy, they were once command economies, meaning that the government controlled all of the means of production, that every citizen of those two countries once worked for the government. That's what a command economy is. And now they're what we call an open market economy, that you could move to China, you could start a business there, and you could operate with certain degrees of freedom from government restraint. So once more, Russia, China have been moving toward this direction. Now, the big difference that we have to understand is that Russia underwent a communist revolution in 1917. Tens of millions of people died as a result. It was a swift change that resulted in extreme communism. China underwent the Chinese Civil War in 1947. Once more, tens of millions of people died. It was a swift change that resulted in a very strict economy. The good news is the recent changes have occurred slowly in a far more peaceful manner. Instead of the tens of millions that died due to the swift change, it's been slowly transitioning. So, Russia. The Soviet Union officially collapsed in 1991. The last premier of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, declared that the former Eastern European Soviet blocs, like Ukraine, like Czechoslovakia, like Yugoslavia, these countries would be allowed to decide for themselves if they wanted to remain part of the Soviet Union or if they wanted to be free. Most chose to remain free. And so by 1991, the Soviet Union was dismantling and had officially collapsed. So the question is why? Well, part of it was they were on the verge of complete economic collapse. Germany is a great example of a country that just collapsed economically. When it did, their money became worthless. Their entire economic system, business owners couldn't pay their workers because currency was worthless. And so production essentially halted. And the only way they could get back to work was a dictator to rise up and shoot anyone who didn't work. He got him back to work, but he tried to conquer the world. We all know the story of the Nazis. And that's a terrifying place for a country to be. And the Soviet Union saw that they were on the brink. They were headed that way. And so they had to make some drastic changes. So these state-owned factories were transferred over to private ownership, and stock markets were created. A new open-style market was implemented in the Soviet Union. Even though this was a somewhat peaceful transition, it's still difficult. In fact, the early post-Soviet era was a very economically depressed time. But over time, the economy has begun to improve. Meanwhile, on to China. So, in the 1980s, China found that the command economy was just simply not working for their business end. They were economically behind many of their neighboring countries. And while they have retained strict controls over their citizens, they're certainly not a free country. They have begun to reform many of the economic systems that they were using, allowing some degree of private ownership of the means of production. For example, I have a friend who's an engineer for a cell phone company. Their manufacturing is based in China. He works for a private corporation. Also, China has been united with Hong Kong. So Hong Kong was part of the British Empire for many, many years, and then it was handed over officially in 1997. China has done quite well. Their GDP, their gross domestic product, is far larger than ours. They have, for example, more honor students than we have students. They're a huge country in regards to population. Their economy is enormous. Most of the things that we import are coming from China. And so they have experienced extreme growth. But yet, unemployment has remained high. Or this economic transition is not always that simple. Well, the next thing, I want to define what a developing country is for you. Developing country is one whose average per capita income is only a fraction of that in more industrialized countries. Essentially, they are a poor nation. And we're looking at that as, what does the average person make? How much money does the average person make? We've talked a lot about the $5 t-shirt and how that's even humanly possible. It's mainly possible because the $5 t-shirt is made in a developing country who pay their people so little that the average person is working for starving wages. Once more, we call that a developing country. A traditional economy is another term I want to define for you. That is an economic system in which the decisions of what, how, and for whom to produce are based on custom or habit. They're called traditional economies because they've been around long enough. These countries are not new. We have figured out through practice how these types of decisions are made. In traditional economies, people often go into the same career as their family. I'm from a family of teachers dating back many generations. For the past 100 years, my family have been teachers on my dad's side. Some of you guys come from other families of different types of careers, and maybe some of those careers are passed down. Some of you work for family-owned businesses and maybe will grow up and go into those businesses. That is certainly part of a traditional economy. It's not always the case. Many of you guys have completely different aspirations than your families, but it is often the case. Okay, so what types of obstacles to development are there in both developing and traditional economies? If a country experiences rapid population growth, this can actually be detrimental to an economy, meaning that if suddenly our population were to double, I suppose that's great if we were in the midst of a terrible plague where millions of people were dying, or we had been previously experiencing rapid population decline due to immigration or to low life expectancy, high disease rate, whatever. But commonly, rapid population growth is accompanied by economic decline. Because the question is if we are producing X amount of food and that number only grows arithmetically, well, that places a higher demand on essential products. If our country's economy is providing X amount of jobs and those people need to work to support themselves too, well, then the question remains, what type of pressure does that put on labor? And so it can, again, rapid population growth can hurt an economy. Other factors that can affect an economy. Well, geography is a big one. We are a large country. We're bigger than the Roman Empire at the height of their glory. We really are a huge country. That means we have a ton of natural resources. It's going to make us naturally more wealthy than other countries. Geography and natural resources can also be a hindrance. For example, Britain, meanwhile, is a much smaller country, and during their industrial revolution, they exploited their resources and they began to run out of natural resources and found themselves in a situation where they were importing from all of these other places. War can certainly be an obstacle. Everyone hears, okay, the World War II saved us from the Great Depression, yay! Well, a big part of that is because A, we were selling stuff to all of these nations at war that needed us. We were making tons and tons of money. And B, our involvement in the war was relatively short. We brought in about 20 million people to work directly in the armed forces and about 11 million others to work in war-related industries. The war lasted about 4 years and then boom, it was done. It wasn't fought on our soil. Our casualties were relatively low compared to other nations. And so we came out somewhat ahead, even though it still cost us $248 billion. So in the long term, yes, it exploded our national debt. But in the short term, that investment in people and jobs actually boosted the economy. A great counterexample would be when a war goes on for a very long time, like the Vietnam War. That one was terrible for our economy. In fact, a lot of those war on poverty programs that we talked about in U.S. history, the Great Society, had to actually be shelved, had to actually be discontinued to pay for the war effort because a prolonged war, very bad. Okay, so for developing nations. So as a world, after World War II, we came together and formed the United Nations. And the United Nations were founded on the principle of helping to develop a just, verdant, and peaceful world. A world in which we don't need to go to war on a global scale. We don't need to drop atomic bombs. That's the hope of the United Nations. Well, part of that comes from making sure that these poor nations don't have to be poor forever. How can we help them? What we've found globally is that crime rates parallel the economic stability of a country. It's crazy, but it's true. But if a country's doing very well, their crime rates are going to be lower. And that is one of the strongest correlations to crime rates globally. If the country's economy is doing well, their crime rates are going to be low. And it makes sense that if you can earn an honest living, that's what you're going to prefer to do. There's always going to be the crazies, there's always going to be the criminals, but there will be fewer of those if most of us can afford a decent living, meaning that we're going to live peaceful lives. And so the International Monetary Fund was created, and it helps provide funds for developing nations to develop their infrastructure and build up their economies, as well as the International Bank, known as the World Bank. They can provide loans to countries to help them develop their infrastructure.